Today on the podcast, we're joined by one of the world's leading designers. Thomas Heatherwick has created many of the world's most striking new public spaces and buildings. Heatherwick Studio is behind culture-defining projects like the Vessel in New York's Hudson Yard and London's Coal Drops Yard in King's Cross, where we're recording today's podcast. They've also designed iconic cultural moments like the London 2012 Olympics cauldron and cultural landmarks like the reimagined double-decker bus in London. From Cape Town's coolest building to Google's new offices, Thomas is building daring urban landscapes that will outlive all of us. Diane von Furstenberg called him a genius. Boris Johnson compared him to Michelangelo. Our cities and our buildings have such a profound impact on our lives, but often we don't have time to really think about why that is and how things could be so much better. Today, Thomas joins the podcast to talk about why we need to humanise cities. He's even written a book called Humanise, which talks about exactly this. We also cover the surprising health and climate consequences of not taking this ambition seriously enough. We'll cover why design matters for you, how to put the soul back into buildings, and why we've got cities so badly wrong for a century. Thomas, welcome to the Giant Ideas podcast. When did the idea that a building could uplift and inspire a human being first strike you?
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here chatting together. And I suppose it's a very good question. And it's a good one because it bends your brain as to really dig back into your upbringing. And I was brought up in North London. And when I was about 11, my father took me and we came out at Piccadilly Circus Tube. And we walked down Haymarket straight from Piccadilly Circus past. There was a sports shop called Lily White's that was there.
I remember it well.
And just there on the left, there was a big sign that said the Design Centre. And it was free and the doors were open. And so this was 1981. And you went in and inside I remember seeing a model of a city of the future, which was huge. It must have been 6-7 meters long. And that city was called Milton Keynes, which has subsequently been built. There were electronic knitting machines. And that was fascinating to see that were working. There were robotic arms that didn't use electricity. Okay. And then there were also products for kitchens. There were pieces of furniture, but they were all inventive, pushing ideas, trying to create progress. And it didn't differentiate what was called architecture, what was called master planning, what was called product design, what was called landscape design, what was called engineering. It was just all at a place called the Design Centre that was set up by the Design Council. And I would go back there as a teenager and it gave me a North Star. I know that sounds maybe a cliche, no. But I was good at drawing. I was fascinated by inventors and invention, and I had books with old patents and ways of making new kinds of elevators, ways of holding moustaches out of drinks, ways of cooling people down, ways of stopping them being seasick at sea. There seemed to be a world of ideas. And then there was also a dimension of how ideas looked and felt. And suddenly I saw how those two things could come together. And I hadn't really enjoyed school at all. And I didn't really enjoy the other schools I went to. But I had a North Star. I had a thing going, that's what I want to be. That's it. And they shut it down about 24 years ago.
Oh, no.
Now people are buying online, learning online, working online, meeting, dating, all these funny things you can do. Suddenly streets have lost a bit of that energy that drove them, and streets become dangerous when there aren't lots of people on them, actually. Funnily enough, you're safer.
Yeah.
There are lots of people there. And so reflecting, we realised, what are we doing? Why are we hidden away? How does a little 11-year-old know that anyone designs tallest sculpture in the UK, or the London bus, or an Olympic cauldron, or Olympia, or a piece of China, or Seoul, an island in Seoul, or whatever those things are, you need to see it. You can't be what you can't see kind of logic. And so our new studio is on the street. We squidged the workshop so it goes all the way to the pavement so that an 11-year-old could look through the window and see people making things, not just made things. And we have got the biggest program of any architectural design firm in the UK of working with 11 to 14-year-olds. So we've had 600 children coming through the studio, but the children who no one in their family's been to university before.
Thomas, it's funny. My first trip ever to central London was also to Piccadilly Circus with my late father, and I couldn't say Piccadilly Circus, so it was to Piccadilly Circus, also to Lillywhite. But I remember also coming out from the tube and looking up, and this feeling of complete wonder at the various architectural gems and in some cases monstrosities. So very funny to hear you talk about your memories of that. You mentioned there some fairly mundane architecture as a child, looking at some of these buildings and just wondering why. You've now written a book about it, and you feel, I believe, very passionately that so much of what we build and the cities and the buildings that we build are fundamentally boring, for want of a better word. What went so badly wrong with architecture and why?
Well, I think I should just sort of start by saying the problem is a kind of problem that I think people don't realise is as big a problem as it actually is. And I think if we'd had a conversation 40 years ago about nutrition or about air quality, you would have looked at me with a slightly funny look like, really, do we really need to worry about the air in our streets? Like, come on, it's not a big deal. Shouldn't we be worrying about something else? And 40 years ago, if someone was eating seaweed, for example, you would have thought they were a freak. And brown rice. And but now look at us. Everyone has realised that ultra-processed food was much worse for us than we realised, and we didn't know. And so there is a conversation happening in society about nutrition and a realisation that that has a meaningful impact on our life. But the world of buildings has stepped to one side and it said, no, it's about style. It's style wars, where you prefer old-fashioned, I prefer modern, or whatever that is, and that this is an art. But if you actually look at the statistics, 76% of people say buildings affect their mental health.
Okay.
And there is zero training in mental health about the buildings around us. And I'm talking about not just the buildings you go inside, but we are all passers-by. And look at the epidemic of soullessness that is everywhere you go, every city you go to, the 99% of buildings. I'm not talking about the fancy pants opera house or the art museum that's twisted, or I'm not talking about the Sydney Opera House, anything like that, or the Bilbao Guggenheim. We're talking about the 99% of buildings. It's the everyday buildings all around. Now, there is a mental health dimension, and so I talk about harmful boring. And you might think, what? Isn't that opinion? Isn't this subjective? There are researchers who are starting to properly gather data showing that our bodies go into stress when buildings don't have a necessary visual complexity. So notice I'm not using the word beautiful. It's about things that are able to have a necessary amount of fascination and engagingness, because humans are actually infovores, as in our brains need visual information.
Yeah.
And when you have buildings that are so flat, so plain, so shiny, so serious, so anonymous, so monotonous, add those together, and you will conjure up in your mind, and the listeners will have seen probably 1 million buildings like that. When you put all of those things together, our bodies actually go into stress, which is really interesting and not about your opinion. So using skin conductance data, if you put someone in front of a building with no visual nutrition, basically, your body starts, your stress level, your cortisol level rises. So there's a serious dimension to society's well-being in health. But even if you said, well, actually, you know what, Thomas, I still don't care. This is an architecture-y, design-y talk, isn't it? Don't really... Let's put that to one side. There's a dirty secret around us at the moment. And we look at what society talks about. Society does talk about the environmental impact of the aviation industry. And we all have a kind of, should we fly, should we not fly? And that's almost every family has had that kind of a conversation. And that's in the air. The dirty secret is that the construction, demolition industry is 5 times the greenhouse gas emissions of the aviation industry.
Right.
The average age of a commercial building is 40 years in the UK. So if I was a commercial building, I would have been killed 14 years ago. Given away my age. And the average age in Seoul for quite a while was 30 years.
Okay.
In China, it's about 34 years for a residential building, 35 years for a commercial building. The carbon in a building, it's unbelievable how much carbon it takes to build a building. So suddenly, it sounds really sentimental, but love actually matters. Unless people care, let's not use the word love, let's just say care enough to think, no, don't knock it down, let's repair it, let's adjust it, let's adapt it. The carbon is just off the charts. And it's the dirty secret because people feel powerless. They think, oh, well, that's not, can't impact that. It's only engineers, architects, developers, city planners, politicians who impact that. Even quite wealthy people feel powerless. And we have had an industry that it's talked itself into a mindset that the public are a bit ignorant. And this is a style thing. And if you ask the public, they just want old-fashioned stuff. And what's so interesting, and our research showed this, it's not true. Of the 10 top buildings of the last century, the most popular of those buildings, 7 of them in the world are buildings built within the last century. In the UK, 2 of the top 10, they're new buildings.
Right.
But they're not boring buildings. So suddenly this word that seems like, what? You're talking about boring? You've written a whole book about boring? It's actually a book about society, as the fabric of society that we wrap ourselves in. And too often we talk about buildings about how much light there is inside them, how the atrium is, good circulation, and talk about the architecture internally. And we're not talking enough. Very privileged people are the ones who go inside most new buildings. But 1,000 times more people are going past the outsides, and there is no client for the outside. In simple terms, it's a sort of the client, and you speak to any building designer, they say, my client wants this, and you're happy, you pleased your client. But the outsides, who is your client? It's actually all of us. It's the people who will never go inside that building, who have no voice. And even our industry, and I speak on behalf of that industry, our industry doesn't even ask the public what they think. And if they don't like it, we think they're stupid. It's outrageous. So there's no public conversation. In a way, it's the smallest idea, but that giant small idea is there's no public conversation. You're not an architect, I take it.
I am not.
But I guess you've lived in buildings your entire life.
Right.
So you and I have lived in buildings our entire life.
Yeah.
So how can I say you don't know about buildings?
Right.
You may not have trained in that, but you're a smart person, understatement of the year. But you will have feelings and intuitions, and the idea that you are ignorant about buildings, and we shouldn't be building buildings that need you to go to a lecture to start to appreciate them. challenge is, unless we have a public conversation and demand from an industry and from each other that we must make buildings more human, nothing's going to happen.
I love it. You work all around the world, Thomas. So you were just showing me before we recorded this, some amazing work you've done in Japan and Korea. And to me, in a good way, the buildings look human, but also animalistic in a very good way as well. They sort of come to life. They're living, breathing, amazing things. You do work right across the world. Who is getting this right? So if we think about now, Europe, people come to Europe to look at architecture from 200, 300, 400 years ago, almost like a museum. And partly it's because, they really appreciate the architecture of that era.
Mm-hmm.
In 200 or 300 years' time, where will tourists be going around the world to look at things that are being built today?
My honest answer is, in general terms, no one's getting it right.
Okay.
There is nowhere in the world where 99% of buildings are more human-centered and engaging. There are these kind of clumsy moves which I think to some extent give the world of building design a bad name, in that there's an art museum being built. Someone thinks, oh, an art museum, it should be artistic. Right, let's have a competition. Oh, and then suddenly you get this art museum that is special and engaging, but and the word culture is used. It's a culture building. I don't believe that culture is arts. I believe culture is everything that surrounds us, that we live our lives. And the recycling centre that you go and take your fridge to when it's come to the end of its life, or mattresses to, can be an extraordinary social experience. I remember seeing one of the lead singers from the Specials in North London when I went to the Kentish Town Recycling Centre. And there's a social dimension. And why is that? Why can't the recycling centre have care and attention and engagingness? Isn't it so obvious? The place that has art inside, that isn't it too obvious that it should be artistic on the outside? Why the buildings we cherish from the past, for example, in King's Cross, where we are now, we are here in a place that's really loved as a newly developed area. Look where we are. We're inside an industrial warehouse.
Right.
The Victorians weren't even trying. These were their IKEA sheds of the day. But there were things where the outcome of that making left qualities that are humanly engaging and have an amount of fascination. They have a quality which means that as they get older, they get a bit better. But I'm not advocating that we go back to the past and copy Victorian buildings. We don't need to do that. We can use our brilliant brains, and there are so many well-intentioned, incredible people in the construction industry. There's also incredible industrial processes available to us, but we need to harness them to make more human places. But there is a mindset problem throughout an industry that has a base that's over-academic and that talks to itself. Like, every new building that you walk past is probably award-winning. But who's it winning the award from? It's winning the award from the other building designers. That's totally wrong. I learned that from Dame Sally Davies, who was the former chief medical officer for the UK. And I'd been speaking at something, and someone had asked what would my dream project be, and I said a hospital, because they're the worst places. I'm paraphrasing what she said, but my understanding of what she said was, she then said, you'll only make change in healthcare with these buildings is with patient pull. And I remember thinking, well, what does patient pull mean? And so what I understood her to mean was that those managers are all doing their best with their resources they've got. They're busy, their brain is full. But if there's a new building being built and the patients say, oh, you're building a new cancer care centre, have you seen the one in Dundee using wood? Or have you seen the one in Leeds with plants on the roof? A good leader, in effect, a good leader doesn't really lead. A decent leader listens. But it only works if the patients speak. Now, patients think they're powerless,
Yeah.
but actually, if society speaks, change happens.
Yeah.
Simple. I found it really influential for me in realizing actually I'm very lucky with my studio's work to be busy. We're 250 people doing projects around the world, but that I needed to devote a chunk of my life to trying to help that conversation to happen, because real change won't happen with my 4 projects, 5 projects a year that I finish. That's nothing.
Well, Thomas, you are, your projects are all encompassing. They're a grand scale, but also they touch lots of people. My favorite example of you putting humanity and soul and emotion into your work is the London bus, where this idea of putting warm lighting into these buses, which were so sterile in terms of their environment and lighting, so that people look good on the way back from a date. Your skin looked great, your girlfriend or boyfriend's skin looked great, and probably something that no one had ever thought about in bus design ever. Tell us more about just that particular example.
Well, that comes back to emotion as a function. And I remember hearing our client within Transport for London saying that they'd had the person who designed the buses for many years before come in and say, I must design the new bus because I've designed I've designed all the other buses on the street. And they went, that's why you're not going to design this bus. And we were brought in. We had spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. I'd been looking a lot at the trams there, which are very refined. They are the absolute minimum you need, but they're so loved. The trams that go around with wooden seats, 2 staircases. And we'd had a form follows function mindset, again, with our London buses, but forgetting that one of the functions is emotion. And so we'd ended up in these plasticated, I'm not sure fully if that's a verb, but plasticated boxes where you could look around and you'd think, why are the hand poles nuclear warning yellow? What's that big lump? Why is one guy sitting lonely under a staircase? Like, what's going on? And why does it all this plastic everywhere, look like someone had it in their mouth, sucking it for a year and then put it back out? This sort of, and why are the seats purple? And there was no sense of cohesion.
Yeah.
And looking back, it was 50 years earlier that the London bus had been conceived in its entirety. And what had happened since with these sort of incremental bodges and sort of randomized moves, you could diagnose. If you sat at the back of the bus as a designer, you'd look at those hand poles and think, no one would choose that. And then you'd think, hang on, must be a regulation. A new regulation came in about the contrast level visually. And so you could see someone overreacting. You say, you want contrast? I'll give you contrast. And you get nuclear warning yellow. And you could see there must have been a regulation about light levels. And someone's gone, light levels? Right. There's a regulation about light levels? I'll give you light levels. So it's like a battery chicken farm. The lighting, which, as you say, you look terrible, your partner looks terrible to each other. Like, it's the most unflattering thing. So in a way, our mindset, I'd never used the word dignity before. I thought it sounded really pompous to use words like dignity, but it really felt like the right word. It felt that the buses were not lifting you in your life. And if you're going to spend 30 years going to work, sitting on a bus for 40 minutes, and then coming back, and the next day going there, coming back, going there, that is a big chunk of your life. Does that add something to your life? Is that just neutral to your life? Or is that actually somehow deadening your life a little bit? It's part of the fabric of society. And you share that with the other people on the bus. But I was always sort of fired up in my stomach because you knew that a rich person, typically buses were seen as the lowest rung. It's like almost a bus is a working class thing. And the tube is the middle class thing to travel in. And I remember hearing, actually it was the head of Transport for London saying that a really good city is a city where the rich people take public transport. And I actually thought that was beautiful.
Yeah.
Because that says so much. that means that implies safety, that implies togetherness, and getting rid of the kind of bullshit of separating kind of brackets in society, which I hate. And so you suddenly felt super empowered, because a super rich person could have a Ferrari and they could drive around the city and they can look around at London. London, arguably one of the most important cities, incredible cities of the world. But the front of a double-decker bus, you cannot compare. No matter what Ferrari you're in or whatever, there is no better view of London
Prime spot.
than the front seat at the top of a double-decker bus. And that sort of was our route, and just thinking, right, let's have 2 staircases to maximize the ability to move people, unload and load quickly, with 3 doors, which the old buses that people are romantic about only had 1 door and 1 staircase. So you can more reliably, in time terms, unload and load. And so a bus is more likely to be on time. But the staircases, a staircase, a fiberglass staircase, we can call it composite, but essentially it's fiberglass, which doesn't lift anyone's spirits to say those words. Felt like, how can we make that evoke almost like you're in a stately home sweeping down a grand stair, even though it's narrow? So the stairs at the back, for example, we made the windows follow you, well, both staircases, so that you'd get the best view out of London, and equally you would be seen. So you would feel there's a safety, and you can see people whenever they're in the bus. And so it was really just thinking, how do we evoke feelings and just think about not just what people call function,
yes,
but the true function, which is a mix that incorporates how you feel as well.
Amazing. Amazing. Thomas, I want to ask you, in the book, you have this wonderful boringometer. Okay, which for our viewers and listeners basically tries to help people understand, is a building boring or not? And I was having a go at it and trying to understand how it would work. And I am clearly not doing it right. But when I was working through the criteria, it struck me that a beautiful brownstone street in the West Village in New York, or a lovely Victorian crescent in Notting Hill in London, might be perceived as boring if you're applying those tests. I'm sure that's wrong, though. So tell us a little bit about how you view some of the beautiful buildings, to use my word about those buildings from the Victorian era, for example.
Yeah. Well, the boringometer is a real thing that we developed in the studio, but it's also a provocative thing. Many aspects of my construction industry just would have a style. The designers had one style and they did it everywhere. And you thought, how rude,
yes,
in a way. Surely you want to grow something for each place. But one key insight or sort of backbone of my drive has been anti-flat. The things we tend to like are more 3D.
Yes.
And the things we tend to feel less about are flatter.
Yeah.
And we have certainly had, we call it a blandemic. And the blandest buildings tend to be flatter.
Yes.
And repeating too much. And so what the boringometer in the book is looking at, it was actually an idea that grew out of thinking a bit like those pin toys. The pin toy where there are a whole lot of little pins, metal pins. It's sort of an executive toy that maybe some of your listeners might have on their desk, or would have 20 years ago or 30 years ago. But you push your face into it or your hand, and all the little pins go around your face or your hand.
Yeah.
And then you take your hand away and there's your hand or there's your face. So it's the equivalent of a tool digitally that you can take any building, built or unbuilt, still to be built,
yes,
and digitally push these pins in, pull it away, and then you can measure how much it deviates from flat.
Okay.
And you can measure how much there is repetition without complexity. Because in the research that we've been doing, the main thing we've been finding is places that we like have an amount of three-dimensionality, an amount of repetition, but they also have an amount of complexity, not just dumb repetition. And so absolutely the brownstones you're talking about, they're 3D.
Okay.
You know, you if there's a window, the window isn't flush with the wall outside. The window goes in. There isn't just a hole cut in a wall. There's a sill that sticks out.
Right.
There isn't a roof that's just a straight line. The roof goes up and down. The roof doesn't just start at the top of the wall. There are eaves. The building overhangs. There's staircase that jump. The brownstones have these spectacular stoops. I think they call big stairs going up and railings. And so there's a lot of three-dimensionality going on.
Yeah.
So the boringometer would capture that. It's trying to objectify and move away from the style conversation. So instead of saying, oh, do you like modern, which means you like square stuff, and I like old-fashioned or whatever, it's style neutral.
Okay.
It doesn't care.
Right.
And so I think we need to have a more open-minded, creative look at how do we harness the industry that exists, the technology, all the things we now have, but combine that with understanding our brains.
Okay.
And believing in joy. Because ultimately, that book is about joy, and that joy is actually the only sustainable thing. Because if something gives joy, you have an obligation to create joy if you are making buildings happen. And unless society says, oi, stop making nutritionally poor, boring buildings, because those are the buildings we knock down again after 40 years.
Yes. Yes.
And an example is a tower in the City of London. So by global standards, that's not a big tower.
Yeah.
But in London, a reasonably big tower, it takes 4 kilos of carbon to make a Big Mac. It takes 250 tons to put a rocket into space. And I think it's 92, let me just get this right. I think it's 92 million tons of carbon to build one of these major towers.
Wow.
Which is equivalent to 23 million Big Macs.
Wow. Thomas, we've got, I think, about 4 minutes. I'm going to ask you 2 questions, which could take another 4 hours each, but we'll try to cover them in 2 minutes. The first, you export Britishness around the world, I guess, because you happen to be British. What is unique about British culture, in your view?
It's a brilliant question. And me and my team work all over the world. And I hadn't realised how deep and how passionate I was actually from a British perspective. It's deeper in me than I realised.
Really?
And the other day I had to talk about this, and I realised how incredibly privileged I was. I wasn't brought up privileged in financial terms at all, but I was brought up in London, which is endowed with the most incredible institutions and vast variety of places and people. And I could only think of it almost like peat, that we have the layers of culture that we have the chance to stand on, to give me confidence. The key thing to do anything worth doing is confidence. And for me, all those layers, many, many centuries of this deep, older culture have empowered me. And it's a funny one when I go around the world and you talk to people and the people say, what's unique about Britain? And I had to ask that question when I built the British Pavilion at the World Expo in 2010. I had to represent the UK. And I spoke to a friend of the studio and she looked at me, and she travels all the time, all around the world. And she just looked at me and went, eccentric. And she said, that's what's different. And I didn't tell the British government, but it superpowered me. And I thought, where does that come from? That's confidence. To go against the grain comes from, I'm not speaking about me, I'm talking about thousands of incredibly creative people who base themselves here. And it's that deep cultural peat, coming back to peat. I don't know how many of your listeners know what peat is, but that layer things up, that you allow you to leap from that place and dare to think of ideas or push for them with a confidence. I think many people have ideas, but it's your standing on the ground that's necessary to take ideas and really argue for them, make a place for them, and make them affordable and logical to people.
I know, Thomas, that you feel very passionately that we need in this country more creative confidence. I know that when we were inputting, both of us, into the incoming Labour government's policy discussion in a non-partisan way, that you struck me as saying there might not be much money around, but we do actually really badly need some creative confidence back in this country if we're going to achieve anything of any merit.
Well, the thing that real creativity is actually ingenuity. And I hate the association always that creativity is somehow luxury and that it's a sort of over and above. To me, it's when you are fighting for your survival, that's when you need the greatest ingenuity. And that's when you need to be bravest. And there are challenging economic times around us, and that's when we need the confidence. But so much of human nature thinks, oh no, that's for later. Actually, it's for now. We need to build millions of new homes. It's for now. Now we need to build the homes that we won't want to knock down, which we did build millions of homes that have already been knocked down after the Second World War, and loads of places, catastrophic use of vast amounts of concrete, instead of making places that we could cherish and adapt and adjust. And it needs cunning, clever, brilliant conversations to drive that forward. The thing I really want to emphasize is that the world of building design has seen itself as the art above all other arts, as hierarchically looking down on society more broadly. And actually the big shift we need is to see ourselves as servants in public service, and that our job is it's sort of servant architectship for the world around us, is that we're serving. So we must be fascinated by each other. We're making the walls of public life. What an honour, what a responsibility. That needs ingenuity. And often it's in times of challenge that the big breakthroughs come. And if anyone can think of those things, it's this creative community that exists. And I also believe many people are creative. This isn't the sort of elite you have to have studied to be the only people who are creative.
Yeah. This has been a cunning, clever, brilliant conversation. Well, let's end with a question we ask all of our amazing guests on this show. We don't ask them, are you an artist? But I would also like to sneak that in there. Are you an artist? Do you consider yourself an artist? And fundamentally, what is it about Thomas Heatherwick that has allowed you to become the person, the success that you have become?
What a question. I don't consider myself an artist. I consider myself a designer. You don't architect a building, you design it. And I do believe that artistic thinking is needed. But for years I've met people who set up incredibly creative businesses, and they say, I wish I was creative like you. And you're looking at them thinking, what do you mean? The idea you had for that business is a creative move. And so you are being creative. It is artistic. It's the thinking of the unexpected thought. And so I suppose I see what I do as very practical and down to earth in many ways, which is to just think about what would engage other people. I don't see it as some voodoo, funny, mystical thing. And I think the art world loves to create a kind of bubble of sort of extra power. I suppose I don't mind the sort of down-to-earthness of saying I feel what I do is solve problems, but I also spot problems. And by spotting them. That the biggest creativity in a way is spotting what might need to be done. And I hope that I can keep being trusted to do that. It takes a long time to be trusted with $1 billion of construction, or some of our projects. It's the trust that's put in you is so massive. So I feel incredible responsibility. And so I suppose I feel my job is to convene and clarify, bring together, so that we can kind of hold hands and take and de-scarify making futures that aren't copying the past.
That's a lovely way to end. And I really think that of all of our guests who've come on the show who do have these giant ideas, I think probably your ideas will outlast all of them. They'll be here in hopefully hundreds of years' time. And I think that's a wonderful thing, having experienced some of them all around the world. We're very lucky to have you in the world, and very lucky to have you on the Giant Ideas podcast. Thank you for joining us, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Tommy.
If you've enjoyed that episode, do share it with a friend, and we'd love to share more giant ideas with you wherever you get your podcasts.